A very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We want to welcome you to Let's Talk. We are delighted to join you for part two. Let's talk of. We are delighted to join you for last week. We had a very interesting discussion last week, and this week we are continuing. Of course, we had a special guest with us last week, Dr. Lyndon Tellisford. She is an associate professor at the St. George's University in Grenada, and her expertise is in the area of public health and environmental health. She is going to be answering our questions with respect to environmental stewardship. I like to say that as Seventh-day Adventists, we have a responsibility towards our environment. We believe that God is the creator. We believe that he has given us a certain stewardship responsibility, and it is important that we understand how we can fulfill that responsibility in a meaningful way. However, before we go into the discussion, we would like to invite you to bow with us for a word of prayer. Eternal Father and our God, be with us as we share. We thank you for the opportunity to share with our friends in Radio Lands and those listening via the various electronic platforms. We ask for your wisdom and your guidance. Take full control, grant that our connectivity will hold and everything will go well in Jesus' name. Amen. So I want to this afternoon, before we go any further, just welcome again Dr. Tellisford. Dr. Tellisford, it's a delight to have you back with us. Good afternoon.
You. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be on again for week 2.
Well, I tell you that I've been getting so much feedback on the discussion last week. You know, as recent as, was it Thursday, I visited somebody in a business establishment, and the individual, I wasn't even aware that they were listening. They said, you know, I'm sharing this link with others. The discussion was so meaningful. And people continue to ask questions. People continue to inquire. We want to begin by, I'm thinking it might be a good idea just for us to briefly, I mean, there are 1 or 2 questions that individuals ask. We're going to get to that in a minute. But can you just, we looked at the whole aspect of challenges of industrialization, the effects of plastics, and we ended by talking about animal production for food. But I'm wondering if, before we go any further, can you just provide a brief synopsis of just to bridge the gap from where we left off last week to what we're going to talk about this week?
Okay, certainly. Yes, and it's good to know that people are, or audience is taking interest in the program. So let me just say a pleasant good afternoon to all of you joining us, and just a synopsis of what we spoke about last week. We established that God created the environment for our health and our well-being. So there is a meaning and purpose behind the environment. We were given the task since the Garden of Eden to care for the environment as much as we care for ourselves. And we established, and there is an intricate link between the environment, the state of the environment, and human health. Now, last week, we touched on the whole issue of industrialization. And we said that industrialization is good because it contributes to meeting the needs of human beings in terms of medicine, in terms of food, clothing, machinery, etc. So it's a good thing that we have all of this industry set up so that our on-demand needs can be met. However, industrial activities have also contributed largely to environmental pollution of our air, water, soil, food animals, food plants, etc. And that in itself is a major problem, because we are now exposed to a lot of chemicals, substances that affect us. We are exposed through the food that we consume. We are exposed through the direct contact, skin contact, dermal contact, through the eyes, inhalation, etc. And that has contributed to the deterioration, not just of the environment by virtue of pollution, but also to the health of humans, plants, and animals. So we need to strike a balance. While industrialization produces to meet our on-demand needs, we also need to be mindful that the more we consume, the more we produce waste, and we only have limited space for waste disposal. The earth is not expanding, so we only have so much space. We are trying to live, work, play, do everything else on this surface, this area that we have. And if we keep depositing so much waste into that area, then it would only come back to haunt us. We spoke a lot about plastics last week as well. We spoke about phthalates, plasticizers. And yes, while it gives plastic its flexibility and durability, we also said that exposure to plastics can be of phthalates, plasticizers used in plastic. Some of these are volatile compounds, can be very dangerous for us, interferes with the endocrine system, and contributes to cancer development as well. So we need to be very careful about storing foods in plastic wares, especially when it is exposed to heat. Right? We need to be careful, because volatile compounds, they go into a gaseous state, and some of them, they are trapped in the foods. And as we consume the food, we are consuming those harmful chemicals. So we said use more stable products such as glassware. I'm going to speak a little bit about aluminum a bit later, because somebody, I think, had a question on the aspect of putting foods in aluminum, but metal generally is safer, like stainless steel, whereas those can be better because they're more stable, right? For storing and so. Then we spoke about animal production. Animals are beneficial to the environment, for food, for companion, for some of us as well. However, the condition under which we have, especially for the purpose of food, mass production taking place is usually not ideal. And one of the biggest challenge is the indiscriminate use of antibiotics in food production. So we have the situation where so much is being used, and it is not properly processed in the animal before we would kill or produce the animal for food. That sometimes you have these antibiotics remaining, and then there is the issue of the release from animal production into the environment. And again, humans are exposed through the soil, water, etc. And that becomes a major problem for medical practice in particular. We have concentrated animal feed operations, again, where we have high release of methane gas from animal waste. And so methane is also a greenhouse gas. It contributes to climate change. You have the foul smell from these operations, and generally waste being emitted from these kind of operations degrade the condition of the environment. Pastor Greene, many years ago, I went to a conference, and there was a lady there speaking about the experience of the community living next to CAFO, concentrated animal feedlot. And she noted that almost everyone in that community was sick for almost the entire lifetime. Asthma problems, skin problems, just inhaling constantly this foul smell. You know, at nights they try to close the house so that they can sleep. But then it's warm, it's hot. So they were having problems with that. So they tried to keep the fans on, have the windows open. And she spoke about the many, many health problems that they experience from living in close proximity to these kind of operations. So again, we have to do everything in moderation. And we know that we are not in a perfect environment. Sin has introduced all sorts of problems into our environment, and hence we need to be very careful. We need to be aware of what is in our environment, and we need to take the necessary steps to protect our health.
So I'm sure those who are joining us who did not get an opportunity to hear what we discussed last week have a pretty good concept of what we spoke about. And of course, you can always go back and view it on YouTube. You can go to SLC Church channel, or you can go to SLC Adventist. If you go to SLC Adventist, you may need to scroll through because they have the entire day's production there. And you would have to scroll through towards the end of that program. Now, Dr. You mentioned several things, and I want to go a little deeper into one or two. I know that our time is limited, but I think this is so very important because you mentioned, and I'm going to come to the aluminum issue in a while, but I want to go back to the issue of the concentrated feeding environment for the animals there. Because I remember when I asked the question last week, I did preface the question by indicating that so much of the world's agricultural lands are used to produce feed or food for livestock in terms of meat production. But you raised the issue of the environment where these animals feed. And I remember some time ago seeing something, a documentary that talks about the environment and how that becomes a breeding ground, so to speak, for all kinds of organisms that can eventually impact human beings. In that documentary, they spoke about not just the fact that the environment is not healthy, but they also spoke about the fact that sometimes the animals are sick. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the animals get infected with certain diseases, and they slaughter them and still use them for food because we are not there. We don't see where the meat that those who use meat, where it's coming from. So it seems to me as though if people eat meat, and I don't, but if people do, then it's wiser for them to rear their own animal because they would have a more controlled environment. That is just my way of thinking about it. I don't know if you wish to comment on that.
Yes, certainly. We did some studies, and I would not name the country, okay. Looking at, antibiotic use, for example, in food. And we found that some of the practices are very unsafe. And it comes back to us because we look at now documentaries indicating that we are running out of antibiotic options. What we used to use, like penicillin before, we don't use that anymore, right? Because it's now not effective anymore. Our bodies have and the organisms have adapted, so to speak, to those. So we have to keep finding new antibiotics to use. Now, animal production is one medium through which antibiotics are introduced into the environment. And that in itself comes back to humans. And when we are exposed to low doses, there is this kind of, we sort of adapt to it, if you will, or the organisms in our system, they adapt to it. And when they do so, and we are now ill or sick or whatever, and then we go to the physician and they give us antibiotics starting at a low dose, then we cannot respond to that anymore. They have to keep giving us higher and higher doses until we run out of options. And that is what the world is now facing. So This is a major issue when we speak about animal production, the issue of the use of indiscriminate use of antibiotics, which makes the food itself unsafe, but also it is introduced into the environment and causes some problems as well.
No, that's pretty interesting, because some people reason that, well, I cook the food, so it should be okay. So does the heat have any effect on, the safety of the food? We talk about the bacteria, but you're now talking about the dosages. And I know in some region where they are barbecuing, where they are grilling and that kind of thing, that sometimes, there are questions with respect to whether enough time is given for these things. Is it okay to say, well, I cook my food and that's fine?
Well, it's a yes and no. So generally, antibiotics will kill bacteria, right? And when you cook foods, the heat in itself also destroys some microorganisms. Some bacteria will be killed, of course. But there are sometimes microorganisms that can evade especially foods that are not thoroughly cooked, right? And raw foods again as well. And if the situation is one that the temperature was not sufficiently high to kill the microorganisms, then they will continue to exist in foods. But there are organisms that require different temperature to ensure that they are destroyed. And depends on how the food is prepared, it may not necessarily be at or reach that temperature to totally destroy the organisms. So the safest thing, as I always advocate for, is prevention rather than cure.
Okay, thank you so much. And I see we have a very attentive listener reminding me that phenomena, when you spoke about the resistance, is called antimicrobial
resistance. Yeah, we'll talk about it a little later in the program too.
Now, during the week, I caught up with a few persons, and they asked a few questions regarding the discussion that we had last week. And one of the questions that a lot of people seem to have had interest in is the whole matter of, when you spoke about whether we should use plastics and the fact that sometimes in the heat, the substances are seeped into the food. And they were asking about aluminum. There are lots of things said about aluminum. And so if you can just address that quickly, they wanted to know, is it safe to use aluminum?
Right. So aluminum is very reactive in the presence of acids. And if you want to prove it, I think most of us would have, over the Christmas holiday, boiled some sorrel. Try boiling sorrel in an aluminum pot, and you would see that the area where the liquid covers in the pot will turn sort of black. That's because of the acid in the sorrel reacting with the aluminum in the pot. Now, this is not a healthy situation because aluminum contributes, and that's well established by scientific research, contributes to Alzheimer's. So we are encouraged not to consume, right, aluminum. But when we boil things like that, acidic foods processed in aluminum wares, you have that interaction, and that's interaction, and this is really the formation of salts and so aluminates, as we call it. But again, this is not a healthy situation. So I should have probably said that last week. As much as possible, if you're using aluminum pots and so, except it is coated with a stable substance that prevents or acts as a barrier, then we should avoid putting acidic things in aluminum foil, aluminum pots, etc., because that can contribute to Alzheimer's disease as well.
I think somebody may want to ask, well, how do I know what is acidic and what is not acidic? You know,
Ooh.
the average person who is listening, well, maybe I shouldn't even say the average person who's listening, because they're you know, some of us have a scientific background, and immediately people may begin to think about pH levels in foods, etc.
Yeah.
But
Well,
you use an example, you know, boiling
yeah.
soil, and I think it's easy to see that. You know, but can you just suggest some things? I don't know. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
But citrus is acidic, for example.
uh-huh.
Oranges, those are acidic foods, right? Fruits, some fruits are, quite acidic. So the citrus comes to mind immediately. Lime, oranges, gospo, as we say in the region. Those are highly acidic. Damsel, we call it damsel. I don't know how you call it in other countries. The little fruits that we make
Yeah.
stew with. Those are quite acidic. Food. So those kind of things, sorrel, as we say, some of those things, when you process or boil them, you can actually tell when you see the pot itself turns kind of black, aluminates are being formed and so. So, you don't have to get into a litmus test, but generally there's a taste as well. Acid things, we know the taste of acid. Those we should always avoid putting in aluminum wares.
Very well. Now we kind of started talking about what I wanted to deal with this week, because last week, you may remember, we focused on the macro level, the industrial impact on the environment, such as plastic production, the agricultural lands used for livestock, etc. And the plan really today was to focus on things closer home, and we have already begun to address some of those. Now, most of us reason that we are not directly responsible for those major industrial matters. We're going to focus on the micro aspect, but before I talk about the micro elements, should we really just shake our shoulders and say that, such matters are too big for us? Should we just turn a blind eye and move on? You mentioned, for example, I think last week you did talk about the use of pesticides. You spoke about plastic production. In my country, the government has banned the use of single-use plastic containers. So we don't have plastic straws. We don't have plastic bags that we used to get in supermarkets anymore. Those are now illegal. There is talk about microplastics even ending up in some of the fish. So from the individual perspective, is it okay for me to say, I'm not responsible for all this industrial thing taking place? I couldn't care less. Let me just move on.
Mm-hmm.
Or is there something that we can do about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's something that I hear a lot as well. We often refer to the more developed countries as the main contributor to pollution, to greenhouse gases and so. And sometimes we go away with the mindset that as an individual, I am not responsible. But that is so far from the truth. And I want, our listeners to know, picture their household within the community, whatever the name of your village or your community. Think about you as an individual within a household, and that household within a community. And there is a saying, I think the older people used to say this thing, one drop fill or full the bucket.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Each person, it's like one drop. And what we do at home as an individual matters. Now, if each person is or becomes conscious of some of the issues we're speaking about and understand how to address it and encourages another to do so, we will have what we call a ripple effect. In other words, one tells the other tells the other, and sooner or later, thinking about the world with 8 billion people, just imagine if everyone was to do a small bit, take a simple step to address the global pollution, greenhouse gas emission, and on all of those issues, then it certainly will have a big impact. But just think about your community. Imagine if everyone in your community was recycling, reusing, and reducing consumption, versus if everyone in your community was trying to outdo the neighbor. So every Christmas, you want to throw out your fridge, your stove. You want to have 50 pairs of shoes. You want to buy new dresses all the time and change what you have. Think about that versus if your household and the household next to you and the one next to it, you know, were thinking of and applying the concepts of reuse, recycle, and reduce. If everyone was doing that, then right there in that community already, you would notice change in terms of people's attitudes, their behaviors, their practices, and the environment in general, right? Now, when we throw out a fridge, a shoe, a dress, and so, we do not think really about what is being disposed into our environment apart from the item in itself. But do you know that when you throw out, for example, a fridge, you are introducing metals into the environment. Sometimes you have, depends on the item that we throw out, you are introducing volatile chemicals. You may not smell it, right? But it's there. Hydrocarbon compounds, acids, all of those things are used in the production of these equipment. And when we throw that out, it's not just a fridge, it's not just a stove, it's not just a shoe, but all of the chemicals that are used to make that product is now being thrown into the environment. So again, it makes the point, it begs the question, are we responsible as individuals? Yes. Every one of us, we are all part of the community. And if each one do their part, then together we can have a ripple effect and certainly a global effect.
Thank you so much for that. Let's go now to, I just looked up at the time and realized we're just about halfway through. I can't believe it. So let's quickly go to continue rather with talking about responsible individual behaviors that impact our environment. Can you give us a few examples? Maybe you mentioned about, throwing out of things, but maybe 3 or 4 common practices that directly interfere with the environmental balance of nature. We're talking about environmental stewardship. So some common things that we do around our homes that interfere with the balance of nature.
Cutting down trees.
Wow.
So, and I'm going to call it deforestation, but cutting down trees, that's a problem I think a lot of us don't recognize. It contributes to an environmental imbalance. Now, because it's something good, I'm going to call the name of this entity, but usually I try not to call the name of entity so we don't get into any trouble. But the Caribbean Development Bank is a good example. And they encourage when you do products that when you cut one tree, you plant another. So you can cut your tree, build your school, but they encourage that you plant a tree to replace that one. And those of us who are building, whether it's your house, some infrastructure, we cut a tree to do something else, we should always adopt that principle. Cut one, plant one, because trees are important, very, very important to maintaining stability of our environment. They contribute to the carbon cycle. We take in oxygen and use oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. Where does that greenhouse gas go? Trees take it in and they use it, right? And then they give out oxygen. So there is that cycle, right? And think about if we keep cutting trees and all that's building up in the air is carbon dioxide, no trees to absorb it, then we are going to have a problem. Trees also contribute to rain precipitation, okay? So it takes in the water, holds the water, releases through transpiration, etc. And then we have rainfall again. That's one way, right? That forests and trees contribute to rainfall, okay? So it's important that we respect trees, as I would say. Trees have a say, they have a standing in our environment, and we should respect that. And it also helps to conserve and preserve the soil as well, right? The other thing is I'm going to introduce this term today, persistent organic pollutants. There are many chemicals that are what we call forever chemicals, pesticides, plastics, PCBs. So, Dr. Greene, that's why we are asked to shift from plastic to paper-based products. Plastics are what we call forever, most of them forever chemicals. So, for example, in St. Lucia, a study was done, and they found that some chemicals that were disposed of years ago in the area of the port, it is still there in the soil many, many years later, right? They don't go, some of them. So we have to be careful about disposing. We know that farmers, we've seen it in research, dispose of chemicals in the soil. And sometimes we don't think what is now agricultural area or lands may become residential area. And then people go to live on those lands. And guess what? You see children start developing all sorts of stuff after playing when it rains, because these things are seeping up back to the surface. And then we wonder what's happening to the child. Or why is it that we have, so many cancer cases in a particular area? And I hope I have time to speak about the Love Canal story in the United States. But then again, it shows that indicates the need for us to take care of the environment. Do not throw chemicals into our environment apart from proper disposal through the system that is set up to cater for that. And then we already spoke about antibiotic stewardship. So that's another one. People who use medications, antibiotics in particular, throw them down the sink, down the drain. They get into the environment. And maybe we do not understand the magnitude of that problem in the Caribbean, but studies in countries like China and other places, when you look at how much antibiotics reside in the soil, in rivers, etc., when they test those resources, then we recognize that this is a very, very big problem, and we need to be mindful of that as well. So those are three things, quickly that comes to mind. Deforestation, we should be careful with cutting down trees. Trees have a standing, and we should leave them to stand as much as we can. Persistent organic pollutants, we need to be careful about pesticides, plastics, PCBs, some equipment, electrical equipment. When we dispose of those, some of those can contain PCBs and so, and they remain in the soil. We call them forever chemicals, right? Quickly, Dr. Greene, in Martinique, in the time of the banana industry in Martinique, you would notice that Martinique has a very high prevalence of prostate, breast, and other cancers. That's, again, is as a result, or they have found an association between the chemicals they were using since the days when banana was prominently produced in Martinique, and those kind of cancers, right? It's known as one of the most polluted soils in the world, Martinique, because of the banana industry and all of the chemicals that they use there. They have been banned for many, many years, but still to this day, generations are affected. High prevalence of cancer among men and women in Martinique because of the exposure to these forever chemicals.
Now that is alarming. I mean, and it makes me wonder about some of the things we do and take for granted. Now, I want to ask specifically about okay, let me use this example, because in Antigua there is, last week I mentioned invasive species. We now have the giant African snail in Antigua. I don't know if it is in Grenada, but the giant African snail is creating havoc for farmers. The idea of they have now developed some kind of poison that you can put to a bait, they call it, that will attract the snail and then they will die. And I've heard concerns, you're putting this in your field, it's killing the snails, will it impact human beings? So when we sell these kinds of things, should there be some regulations with respect to the use of them? And should I just go into a store and purchase something and use it? How does it impact human beings? I'm just wondering. Any guidance?
Yeah, there should be regulations. All chemicals should be regulated by either your pesticide control board or some regulatory body. So if the ministry is bringing in a chemical or have approved, the ministry has approved a chemical for use, usually they should have already checked the ingredients in that chemicals to ensure that it is safe. Now, there is something that we call the it's like precautionary principle. That's the term I'm looking for. Precautionary principle, where in the absence of I don't want to say excessive, but in the absence of definite answers, we encourage caution. So if whatever chemical is in this particular product has not been properly researched, we as public health experts encourage the application of the precautionary principle. We say be cautious in using this in the absence of definite or conclusive research and answers with regard to the impacts of that particular product. But I believe the ministry would have done due diligence. And if there are any concerns, persons are responsible for, again, individuals are responsible for reporting those. Now, let me just briefly say this. Sometimes people use a chemical in, let's say last week or last month, and then they would have gone to the physician after and they were diagnosed with cancer and believe that this particular chemical would have contributed to them being diagnosed or developing cancer. Cancer has a long latency period, 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes. Different types of cancers have different latency period, and cancer has a long latency period. So sometimes they have to test these chemicals over a very long time. That cancer is just one disease, but several of these non-communicable diseases and chronic diseases, they have long latency periods. So things do not happen overnight. If you develop, for example, or you're diagnosed with cancer today, it means that you might have been exposed, and that process would have started 10 years ago, etc. And that is why it's important to understand what we may have been exposed to as children, right? What we may have been exposed to during our adolescent years, because in the 30s, 40s, you're diagnosed and you're thinking that it was something recent that happened. Usually, no, it is something from way back. You may have been going to the field with grandma and grandpa when they're spraying chemicals because you were a child and they told you have to go to the garden with them. Later on, you develop some kind of symptom, cancer and so. And then you're thinking it's, oh, well, let me look around the house or so, or where did it come from? No, these things have long latency period. And this is something that we need to be mindful of. So when you go to the physician sometime, they need to talk about what you may have been exposed to years and years ago to try to see if there is some kind of association.
Could we talk a little bit about insecticides that we use in our homes? When I was a child, for example, Baygon was a popular thing. Mosquitoes come into your house and you take the Baygon and you spray it. Now I've heard in some countries that it is banned. It's a banned substance because the claim is that they are carcinogenic. Some of these things that we use to kill the common creatures around our homes, the mosquitoes, the ants, the roaches, do they really have any impact on the human being?
Yes, some of them do, because really, and some of us have actually felt the effect. I remember when we had Zika and chikungunya around, there was a product sold at a store, and I bought the product because people said it was good. So I bought this product at the store, regular store, not a pharmacy or anything like that. And I put the product, activate it, as we say, plug it into the wall. So this thing should be coming out, vapor should be coming out and keep the mosquitoes away. And I went to sleep in that room. And when I got up, I was confused. I'm seeing the slipper at the foot of the bed. I'm trying to put on the slipper and my feet are moving in all directions and I cannot get the slipper on. And I'm wondering what is happening to me. I'm dizzy, confused for a while. I called the store and I brought the product back to them, and they said to me, well, no one else has complained. But again, this is a product that is coming in as a household, insecticide, if you will. And maybe other people might have experienced something and maybe just thought it was normal. It could have been a child that did not know what was happening to them. And so we need to be careful with some of the products. Remember, these are substances that are designed to have a certain effect on the animals, on smaller animals, insects, etc. But as we inhale them, they were not made for human use and consumption. So they are also toxic to humans. Most of them are. So we should indeed avoid that. If you're going to use those products in your house, you spray, get outside, maybe spray before you leave the home, go out to some function, and by the time you come back, it should be okay. But we should never spray insecticides and remain in the household.
Sorry about that. I was muted for a while. Here was a question that someone is asking. In fact, there are two questions here. I probably want to tie them together. This one more is, should we not include into our education curriculum a course in civic pride? I think this has to do with, the disposal practices of persons. And the person is suggesting that it should be done from preschool. So apart from the chemicals, the pollutants, etc., sometimes just the very appearance of things. I drive and I see people eat or drink something and they just throw the bottle or the can through the window. That disgusts me. So that's a matter of civic pride. But we're also saying that some of these things that we're disposing may also impact our environment.
Yeah.
You may want to comment on that, but let me just add this one. What can be done to encourage curbside recycling and sorting of household waste? The individual is asking.
So for the latter, this is a policy issue. The country has to have the policy or the law or the regulations in place to manage that, kind of thing. Here in Grenada, for example, we do not sort garbage. You put everything in except those white goods, fridge and stove, and so you don't put that in. But you put everything else in, basically, and they would pick it up and throw it. So there is no sorting at that point. It happens in the landfill. So it's important that if we want to especially recycle things, that we have that kind of, the policy must be in place to facilitate that. With regard to civic education, that's a very, very good point. What we have seen in agriculture studies is that the majority of people practicing farming would have completed school at primary and secondary levels. And few people who would have completed college and university are involved in agriculture at the commercial level, if you will. No, or full-time, as a full-time, occupation or livelihood. Now, that in itself is significant, because if we do not have this level of education or this information being disseminated at the primary school level, then that person who is entering this practice And there are several other professions that are dominated by people who would have completed school at those levels. And if that information is not disseminated there, and we wait until you get to university to learn that, then we would have missed a significant group. And this can contribute to major problems. Now, the issue of agriculture and pesticides use, for example, is not one of just farmers' exposure. And Dr. Greene, I really hope we have some time to talk about that US study. I want to share with you what they found from a study in the US. Maybe this is a good time to do so.
Yeah, I was going to say you might as well go ahead because you might not get back to it. Yes.
To it again, right. So from studies in the United States, there is what we call the Agriculture Health Study in the United States that is done in, I think it's North Carolina and Iowa. And that study started in 1993. It's what we call a longitudinal study. So it started since then. And they recruited 89,000 people, almost the population of Grenada. They recruited all these people into the study, farmers and pesticide applicators and their spouses. Now they have included their children. That study is still ongoing since 1993. And every year they publish what they find from this study, from the use of pesticides. And what they have found is that those chemicals, they have found a link between the use of those chemicals and the following to date. 1, breast cancer. 2, prostate cancer. Sleep apnea. Parkinson's disease. Kidney cancer and kidney failure. Rheumatoid arthritis. Lymphoid cancer. Shingles. Diabetes in 2008. I always talk about this thing with diabetes and pesticides. It's not just about eating foods that are low in carbs and so. Exposure to pesticides contribute to diabetes. And this is a solid study, most rigorous types of study that you can find. Thyroid cancer, lip cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, wheezing, and recently they found loss of smell after 20 years among people using chemicals, pesticides. What is sad is that I took time to look at, and I've been following that study a lot because that's the area that I did my doctoral study on as well. What is sad is that the University of the West Indies did a study and published in 2016 a statement indicating that the Caribbean, the Southern Caribbean, is on a pesticide treadmill. You know what that means? Treadmill, you're going, right? We are on a pesticide treadmill, says the University of the West Indies. Worse yet, the chemicals that they found associated with these problems in this study in the United States, we are using a whole lot of them still to this day in the Caribbean, right here in Grenada. All of the Caribbean countries, we have a serious problem with the use of these chemicals. I was happy to hear St. Vincent banning malathion just a few weeks ago, I think in December or early January. St. Vincent took steps, ban malathion. Right? Yeah. Still being used in several countries, right? There are other chemicals contributing to these problems that we are seeing today. And yet, governments are not necessarily taking the steps. So we have to act like pressure groups, right? Because our environment is being polluted and our innocent children, they're not responsible, but some of these are what we call forever chemicals. They're there waiting for the next generation.
But let me just ask here, because here are these studies, right? I mean, persons listening to this program, I'm sure, are hearing this for the first time. My question is, who is responsible for giving this information to the public?
That's an interesting question.
Sometimes I mean, if I'm
as
a farmer,
researcher, as a researcher, we are responsible, but what we normally do is prepare the reports and we give the reports usually to to the government. There should be a research unit in all ministries of health and ministries of agriculture. There should be some groups responsible for research, and they have to scan the publications out there, see what's happening, take that to government, and government have to put the necessary regulations and so in place. But as researchers, we are obligated to provide the information to the relevant authorities. Sometimes we disseminate, like in this kind of setting as I'm doing now, but sometimes depends on, again, how these things are going to implicate government and implicate companies. You know, sometimes we have to be careful. I remember when I was doing my doctoral study, I was looking at pesticides and health in the Caribbean and in Grenada in particular. And I had a lot of problems even getting my study approved, because companies in the US were concerned about, if you put that information out there, what it might mean for our products coming into the Caribbean. So I had a battle, but thankfully Grenada supported me, and we were able to get this study through. And that's how we got a lot of this information.
So we're talking about people are looking at the financial benefits over the health of a nation. Maybe that is unfortunate.
It is.
Now you highlighted some, you know, some very serious connections there. You're talking about and I want to just go back quickly to the diabetes that we did make reference to last week. And here it is again, that you're saying that it is not just about people dieting and exercising, but the exposure to certain environmental hazards can impact us in ways that we are not aware of. I'm thinking that we ought to be so very careful.
Yeah, we have to be, because you see, these things interfere with the endocrine system. They are carcinogenic, some of them cancer causing, mutagenic, they interfere with the genetic structure, and then some of them, they interfere with the endocrine system in different ways. And when they do that, you remember the diabetes, you know, we talk about insulin secretion and so, and the management of sugar and processing of sugar. The pancreas and kidneys are part of the endocrine system. So if you have a chemical interfering with the endocrine system, you know, you can easily have those kind of outcomes. And they have found that in the United States, that farmers who use certain chemicals are at higher risk. They found that the diabetes was more prevalent among those farmers using certain chemicals. There is another chemical too that we use commonly in the field, and we also use it in the house, carbaryl. We call it sevens. That's the name that we use for it.
Yeah,
very dangerous. Very dangerous. This is something that we should never use in any environment to which humans are going to be in which humans would be exposed to it. Very dangerous as well.
But I can walk into a store tomorrow and buy that.
Of course you can,
because I have some ants someplace, and I go and I say I need something to kill some ants, and they tell me, look on the shelf there, you see 7, and we purchase it without understanding the effects. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, carbamates, which we need to, carbaryl is something we need to be careful, very careful with. And it's something we don't recognize. As a child, I recall, you know, in houses, in the community, you just put 7s down. And it's something that I'm finding out now, it's very dangerous, very dangerous.
Well, let me ask this question quickly. You have really sparked my interest in this long-term study that started in 1993 and still ongoing. And now I'm wondering, now they're studying the impact on the farmers themselves and on their spouses and now on their children. My question is, those chemicals that are being used, is there any way that those chemicals may also be polluting the products that they're selling? You know, they may be using them as pesticides, they may be using them to kill the weeds, etc. But could they also be impacting the food that they're producing, and the individuals who are purchasing those and consuming them may also be getting the effects? Is that a possibility?
That happens all the time. may not be in some places, but certainly in others. There are places, especially in the US, I know, where you must do a pesticide safety course before you receive license as an applicator to apply pesticides, right? And then on a particular farm, and then the farm owners, if you will, they are also educated on when you can harvest the product. And there is a whole monitoring system, especially for commercial products. But when you're producing for commercial business. However, in the Caribbean, we do not have that kind of system. Anybody can get up any day, say, I am going into farming, agriculture, go to the store, buy any chemical, start applying it, and have no idea as to what's the period between harvesting and or last spray and harvesting should be. No idea of that period. And just harvest, they spray and then they just harvest right after. And that product comes to the supermarket looking nice and healthy. We purchase it and we are exposed. So we do not have that system in the region. All of these chemicals, there should be a period between your last spray and harvesting, right? And sometimes we do not respect that that at all. The same thing happening in food animals. When you feed them certain things or you apply certain medications, etc., there is a period that you're supposed to wait before you can kill the animal for meat and so. And sometimes farmers are not educated about these things. And again, we have systems that are not, our human resources are limited. So our monitoring may not be optimal sometimes.
No, I mean, we need to say so much more on this, but our time is up. But before we go, I do want to get to a couple of questions that individuals have asked here. Let me begin with well, very quickly. We have 2 minutes, so let's do this very quickly. Are air fresheners harmful to humans?
I'm not even sure if I can answer this question. But these are aerosolized chemicals, and again, maybe we should not be inhaling those things. Maybe we should not. Look at what is on the can itself. A number of chemicals are in there, and it's used to make your home or whatever smell good, but maybe you should not be inhaling those chemicals. That would be my answers. The thing is, I can't speak to specifically what is in the can, but those kind of compounds we should be, yes, definitely careful with, because they are chemicals, really.
Now, I know you do studies in rainwater harvesting. And we don't have a lot of time, but there's this question relating to the use of these plastic water tanks that people use for storing rainwater, for harvesting rainwater. Last week, we mentioned that when the plastic is exposed to the heat, that there is some kind of danger there. Now, of course, I suppose we are talking about a different structure of the plastic. But let me just ask you, the question is there any concern for storing, harvesting rainwater in these plastic tanks?
I've always heard people speak about that concern has been raised in various settings. But as I said before, it depends on the type of plastic. Some are more stable and they're less likely to have leaching or leachate entering into the water. So generally the black tanks, as I see, is being used, and I'm not sure there is really any I'm not sure what the research is showing with regard to that. I've always heard concerns, but I can't speak to it here because I'm not sure whether research has shown any association with any particular disease or outcome or so. So I really would not want to say something that, I'm not too sure about. But for now, this is what is recommended for outdoor use for storage of water. You're muted.
I was just sorry about that. I was just saying that our time is up, and I want to express
Uh,
gratitude. Of course, there's still so many other things that we need to talk about. I think one of my takeaways here is, if I have my backyard garden and I can do my own planting and harvesting, and rather than depending on all of these chemicals and fertilizers, that I'm safer that way. But thank you so much for sharing with us. It's valuable information, practical information. The environment that God has given us, we ought to take care of, and we didn't have enough time to deal with this. But I think I can say that one of these days you will come back and we will talk about some other things. It was a delight to have you with us. We appreciate the time that you've taken from your busy schedule, and we want to wish you God's blessings. To those of you who are listening, we want to remind you that Let's Talk continues next week. Going to be same time, 3 p.m. We will have another engaging discussion, and we're looking forward to seeing you. Again, Doc, thank you so much. May God be with you. Appreciate the information that you have shared with us.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me on.